So, this is a topic and a half, really. It has to be. Being the benchmark Navy. Now, why am I doing this? Where has anyone actually suggested this topic? Well, honestly, there have been quite a few questions around recently, which means that I think, whilst I've always tried to cover this point and tried to explain it, I either haven't done a very good job, or the videos where I've really explained it are so far in the past that they might as well not be there. Because there is sometimes that as a reality. Sometimes the videos are so far in the past that you might as well not have done them. They are so far back. So, I'm going to do a video about this. I'm going to do a video about the realities of being the benchmark Navy, because there are issues. There are very real problems with being the benchmark Navy. There are very real commitments that require on you, and there are very real advantages from it. But another phrase for being the benchmark Navy is being the first naval power in the world. This is important. There are therefore going to be criteria when you achieve this status, and if you wish to maintain this status, upon you which are upon no other Navy in the world, other than those necessarily seeking to supplant you. For you, there will be issues, if you're this Navy, that are going to affect your construction over and above other considerations. You are going to pay premiums for certain advantages, for certain things to happen. You're going to accept certain costs. And other scenarios, something which is maybe the strategically most sensible thing for you to do is not the most strategically sensible thing for you to do. Because you cannot afford, for all your other commitments, for that to be the case. So, today's topic, today's video is going to be being the benchmark Navy. There is going to be a little bit of UAD stuff at the end, which I'm just tagging on for a bit of fun for you all, because otherwise it's going to be a very heady, lovely discussion lecture. A discursive concept. And that's a good thing. But I do know that it's always good to have some light with the heavy. And so there's going to be light stuff at the end. Okay? So, being the benchmark Navy. If we look back through history, when have there been benchmark navies? When has there been a navy which has been worldwide revered as being the first amongst equals, or the first navy of the world? In reality, the Spanish would try and claim it at a certain point in time. You could argue for a short while the Dutch might have possessed it. In the ongoing saga that was the various Franco-British, Franco-Spanish on everyone conflicts, there were many who would like to claim to being it, but honestly, no one really was. And there is a reason for this. The ships are much of a muchness. Yes, you can argue that some built some truly, Principe de Austria, etc., truly massive first rates. But everyone has truly massive first rates. And yes, yours is the most massive of the mahusive. Cute. But it isn't really going to set the world on fire, as it's all built to roughly the same principles. There's nothing there which others cannot emulate if they don't wish to. And there's enough of other criteria going on in the rating system and the way the rating system is structured that you have a problem, because the other navies can just go, well, we have so many third rates, it's absurd. Yes, you have this one wonderful first rate, but that's your whole fleet, and we have 4 third rates sitting around it. So they're basically going to take positions, so they're not firing at each other and just going to blast you to pieces. Shameless book plug. Troubles, Battles, and Darings. Again, Tribal class destroyers. A good example of what you do when you are the first navy in the world and you need to be present everywhere. You need the presence ships. You need ships which look like you have cruisers everywhere. And if you go and look at HMCS Haida in Hamilton, Ontario, she's beautiful, she's worthwhile visiting. I was so lucky to visit her last year, thanks to all your support. If you look at her, and you look at the way her portholes are lined out and everything's put in the dark, she'd look kind of like a cruiser. Because the way she's structured, she looks like she has an armoured belt in the centre there going on. And from a distance, she would look like a cruiser. And she's designed to do so. She has those lines. Why? Because the important thing for a navy which is using its presence, its image, its rank amongst the world, its status amongst the world, to deter conflict, manage conflict, to protect its the global national interests, etc., is to be able to send cruisers to an area, or at least look like they're sending cruisers. Because let's be honest, most people can't tell the difference between a cruiser and destroyer, especially if they are not that connected with the world. Yes, a cruiser is far, far bigger. Far, far bigger. We watching this channel probably know that. Anyone who doesn't know that, well, the cruisers can be built up to 10,000 tons, the destroyers up to 1,800 tons. So basically, we're talking 5 times at least 5 times, 6 times the mass in standard displacement. And that's under the treaty system, okay? Just adding in those clarifications before someone puts that in the comments and goes, Dr. Clarke, you didn't put this in, this clarification. I realise I have to if I look carefully at the comments, I have to make sure I put those in, because I cannot take them as read. I cannot take that stuff as being included, because, of course, unlike a university lecture system, I cannot guarantee you've attended, or at least should have attended, all the previous lectures, or all the previous videos. Sometimes I worry I forget that. I try not to, but I worry I do. When we're talking about a benchmark navy, being present matters. What you're present with matters. But also what image it's projecting and what it symbolises. So training, all sorts of things start to come into play. And for Britain, which was this, I know people like to say tiny island, but let's be honest, Britain is not a tiny island. There are many tiny islands in the world. Well, islands which are literally the size of a postage stamp. Well, figuratively the size of a postage stamp, let's go. There are some which probably are literally the size, just sticking out the island, therefore out to sea, so therefore qualify as an island rather than a undersea isthmus, but we'll leave that to one side. Britain is a relatively small, compared to the landmass it occupies, space. And all of this empire, starting with the original 13 colonies and going on to everything else, depended upon sea power. Most importantly, it depended on Britain's navy being the first navy in the world. We don't talk of Britain as a superpower in this period, because superpower has become defined with nuclear weapons. But we call Britain the world power, or the global, or the first world power. Because they are able to project power all around the world. They have global reach because of the Navy, but also because of their Navy, because of their power, they are perceived as being able to prevent others from achieving such reach. If we consider the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians were scared of two things when they were sending their fleet out, which would eventually end with the Battle of Tsushima. They were scared of Japanese torpedo boats turning up randomly from freighters, which led to them attacking British fishing boats. And they were scared of the Royal Navy interfering, because they viewed at any point along that route, any of the Royal Navy squadrons interfered, the Russians would not make it, because the rest of the Royal Navy would show up. This is what led to a lot of their diplomacy. When the Great White Fleet is going around the world, yes, it makes it. It does a very good job. But it's supported by British colliers. Why? Because Britain has the infrastructure around the world. But also because Britain's decided it's in its interest if the American fleet does manage to sail around the world. Why is it in Britain's interests for there to be another navy which was doing global projection? Because Britain was seeking to try and influence and manage other conflicts elsewhere. Trying to manage the risk in the wider conflict. You make the decision. Theoretically, if you're looking at it from the simple point of view of Britain as its global national standing, surely they should not want another nation to go be sailing around the world. But if you're the first navy, what you want to carefully most manage is who are the second, third and fourth navies, and what their relationships are with you, i.e. the navies who can be most of a threat to you. The US Navy sends a fleet around the world. Look at the other nations. Can they send a fleet around the world that scope and size? Britain can. America has. Who cares that it involved British colliers? America's done it. What's Britain done? Britain selected who the second navy in the world is, automatically pushing down others who are vying for the spot. Because whilst you might have more ships, the image is going to be the American fleet came around the world. Now, why does being first name, what does it mean to be the first navy? Well, it confers a massive psychological advantage on that navy. It means that whenever their presence, no matter what size ship shows up, even if it is a destroyer which looks like a cruiser from a distance, you have the image in your head of the bigger ships, of the wider fleet. That's why they can send a sloop to a major conflict zone where you've got large fleets of other nations vying for power, and they just turn up with a small ship and go, okay, what are you all doing? Because they're the first navy. They don't have to send the full fleet. It's actually cheaper in that way. Because no one really wants them to turn up with a full fleet. Because if they do, you've got a problem on your hands. Because if they turn up, they are turning up. When it comes to action against other navies, there's a psychological advantage there. Because they are the first navy. They're the benchmark. They're the standard for which everyone else is compared. You think you're good, but are you as good as them? They have no doubt in their minds how good they are because they're the benchmark, surely. But you've always been compared to them. Automatically that means they're operating in terms of headspace, in terms of having an advantage because they're in the heads of the commanders of the other navies. The Army's already thinking they're good. Conflict shaping and management. You see, if I'm another power, do I want to take on, get involved in a conflict against the world's first navy? Number 2, yeah, maybe I'll do it. But number 1? Who knows what tricks they've got up their sleeves? If you consider a good conversation you can regularly have to this day about, let's say, the American armed forces, but it was just as true about the British one in British armed forces in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. People would willingly believe the British Armed Forces had all sorts of equipment which they would never actually have and never actually developed, because they were the first navy in the world. They had this development budget. They had this huge pool of resources. And because they had the image of being the best in the world, doesn't matter if they actually were. The image, because they were the first navy, because they were the benchmark. So it allows them to shape conflicts before they even begin. It means being their ally is a premium advantage. So they can raise the price you're willing to pay to be their ally higher. Because being their ally is a premium. It's an advantage. As I've said already, but I want to emphasize that point. So this is what it means to be a benchmark navy. This is what advantages it gives you. But it comes with costs. It comes with very real costs. It requires presence. It does require you have those small ships, those other ships wandering around the world. Because you can't afford, no one can afford, no matter how big and how rich you are, no one can afford to have big ships doing all the duties everywhere. You need to have small ships making up the numbers, providing the mass and the presence. And it requires you to have medium-sized ships probably wandering around the world. But more importantly, it requires you make the benchmarks. Especially as we get into the modern era of construction, especially as we get away from the ships of the line and move into the ironclad era and other later on scenarios. The French build the Gloire. No one remembers her. No one remembers her because she just wasn't that good. The Warrior comes in, that's the benchmark. Why did the British rush with the Dreadnought? Why? Others are building similar ships, you know. Surely it doesn't matter. There is a value for the First Navy in being first. Because that means they're setting the benchmark that everyone else is compared to. If the South Carolinas had been launched first, they would be the benchmark. The Royal Navy couldn't afford that. US Navy was who they were hoping to be, the second Navy. They were an important Navy. They were a Navy they were happy with being second because of, honestly, out of the choices of the other options, they were the best option. They were the most likely to be able to work through things diplomatically and civilly. And also, the other advantage was the US Congress regularly wasn't interested, which gives Britain an advantage. And instead of having to deal with just converting one person's interest, i.e. the Kaiser in Germany, you just had to divert enough of several hundred people's interest in the United States Congress. It's usually easier. They have elections to fight. So they have to think about things like domestic politics and actually what the regular people on the street want. Occasionally. The Royal Sovereigns. It's strange for me to put them in there, but it isn't strange. It's actually there. They are a benchmark. When the Royal Sovereigns enter service in 1891, when they're launched, from that point onwards, they are used as a benchmark. Other nations are comparing their ships to the Royal Sovereigns. And that's important. Because the moment you become benchmark, you have that status. You're what are being compared to. So therefore, you automatically have value. Even if you say, oh, our ship's better than the Royal Sovereigns. True. But the Royal Sovereigns were Britain's first generation of ships. What about their current ships? The conversation becomes very complicated when you are dealing with a benchmark. Now, this is where we come to an interesting thing, because this is why this is coming up. Because there is some interesting debates appearing in comment sections around various things to do with the Queen Elizabeth class, whether or not they were a benchmark or not. And then there's been the further comments about HMS Agincourt recently, and my view on her. And to be honest, Queen Elizabeths aren't quite benchmarks. There's a reason for that. As I've gone through in the videos about the Queen Elizabeth class, about them, the very, big, long videos, the couple of videos I did about the Queen Elizabeth class, if you listen to Admiral Jellicoe, they would have been benchmarks, because I think he would have pushed for them to have the small tube boilers. That was what he wanted. But he was persuaded small tube boilers were not ready. So they're 25 knot ships they're aiming for rather than 28 knot ships, which they could have been. And they have 15-inch guns. Technically 15-inch 42s rather than 45s. Why? Because, again, there's a value in getting the first 15 inches into service, there's a value in the status, and it's a valuable thing in terms of winning, both getting the extra level for the qualitative race going on, which involves America, Italy, Japan, and Britain, of course, and the quantitative race for Germany, in that you are trying to make Dreadnoughts sufficiently expensive that the German army stops the race. Because in political terms in Germany, army will always trump navy. It will always be a case of smack. Always has been. Necessity of having such a large land border. This means that the Queen Elizabeths, as built, as conceived, would have been a benchmark ship. As built, were not. They are almost a quasi benchmark, in that they are definitely a level above for the quality, and we often use them as a benchmark because of comparing and using them for comparative terms, but they aren't. Just as the Orions, which were the first generation of super dreadnoughts, the ones with the 13.5-inch guns, were not a benchmark, and don't even mention there, because no one ever picks on the Orions as being a benchmark. They should do. They're an interesting class, but even the Royal Navy weren't considering them benchmark ships. This leads us to HMS Agincourt, the 6th Queen Elizabeth, which is added on at the end, after the others have already been sort of built, and there's all sorts of interesting things about this program. There's all sorts of interesting things. There's a debate. There's people come to the idea of, well, maybe she was going to have 9 or 12 15-inch guns in triple turrets. Potentially. Maybe she was going to have the first 15-inch 50s. But the thing is, neither of those triple turrets nor 15-inch 50s appear before the end of World War II. Well, before the end of World War One, let alone before the end of World War Two. But, they don't appear before the end of World War One. Okay. What does appear? Well, after she's cancelled, someone finds a whole load of small tube boilers, and this is just a précis, because again there's a video about her on this channel, and my views on her. Someone finds a whole load of small tube boilers which are pretty much built, ready to go for Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. I think they won't actually go into Courageous. Someone finds a whole load of triple 4-inch guns, those mounts they had for rapid fire engagement with destroyers, which were actually terrible. They find 18-inch guns for HMS Furious. Guns which do have to be shortened down to be worked on HMS Furious, hence their 18-inch 40s. So, probably would have been 42s or 45s. They find all these things. And all these things get used. All these things turn up in other ships. So, what is the only potential program that fits in with the 18-inch timeline? It's HMS Agincourt. If you consider again, for benchmark ships, the Royal Navy produced a Dreadnought. They were about due for roughly another benchmark on this current starting point. She would have been launched in roughly 1914, late 1914, early 1915. She's being built by a Royal Navy dockyard. All sort of fits. The thing is, the fast battleship is attractive to the Jellicoe faction in the Royal Navy. And we can get into all this, but the Admiral Fisher comes back, and Admiral Fisher, again, as I've talked about with him and his various parts of the sort of videos recently about his views on big guns, etc., is obsessed with having the fastest ship. 28 knots is not fast enough for him. He wants 30-something knots. And he's prepared to sacrifice armour for it. So for him, Agincourt is not the right gamble, is not the right benchmark. So it's an easy thing for him to cancel. Because for him, building the better battleship is not the sensible route, is not the right benchmark. I would disagree with him. I would disagree with him every day of the week and twice on Sundays. But that's the case. Now, why is this important? Because if we consider again with Agincourt, my firm belief is the reason I think another reason she's going to be a fast battleship, other than the whole scenario of the small tube boilers, is because of the various designs being laid down at this period, including the Francesco Caracolas of the Italians, but others also being considered at this point, which are fast battleships. And just as the Royal Navy had raced in to get the first Dreadnought, I think it was racing in to get the first fast battleship. It had been looking at them for the Queen Elizabeth class, decided not to, for speed of construction and ease of construction, as advised by the industry. Agincourt, at the least, would have had small tube boilers. But, again, 6 18-inch guns. You'll see how she does later. She'll be in the UAD discussions. But how can I be so confident about all this when talking about benchmark navies? Well, because the Royal Navy is not the benchmark navy today. That's the American Navy. And I am sure everyone watching this video will sit there and go, well, you know, this ship is actually better in this way, this ship is better in this way. But then think about it in your head. Think about what you automatically compare all those ships to. You compare them to the American Navy. You compare them to their ships, their benchmarks. Now, you can argue what makes them a benchmark. You can argue if, you know, it's just because they're the biggest navy, so of course they're the obvious benchmark. That is perfectly fine for you to argue. But let's be honest, the reality they are the benchmark is because when they are built, they set the standards for the high tech for that generation. You can argue one of the reasons why we haven't moved forward in modern escort design really that much is because the benchmark is still the Arleigh Burke class. Because the Americans haven't moved forward. In this time, the Royal Navy's on its second, planning its 3rd generation destroyers since the Arleigh Burkes. with the early books. You know, it doesn't matter. The Chinese have had all sorts of generations of destroyers. Doesn't matter. They're not the benchmarks. And we won't really have moved forward till the Americans who set the benchmarks have moved forward. Whenever we're comparing carriers, whenever I'm discussing aircraft carriers, I'm always people always going, oh, why haven't they built it like the Americans have? And there are good reasons for building differently than the Americans. But the Americans are the benchmarks. The Americans had the first supercarriers. The Americans have all these things. And the reason they get them first, one of the reasons they're prepared to pay the premium to invest and go into this new technological area to get there first, is because that allows them to set themselves as the benchmark, which preserves their position. There is a massive advantage to being the first navy in the world. It's an essential advantage to a nation which wishes to exert diplomatic influence around the world at minimal cost. Because what you are as the first navy is you're also the first navy up here. And you are the benchmark up here. And if you set yourself up as that, you have to keep that. Because if you lose that, and this is one of the reasons why, again, it goes back to the fast battleships, etc., in this period. If you lose that, you risk that benchmark status. You risk that first status. No matter what you say, you go, oh, but you're still the biggest navy in the world. The moment you lose the benchmark status as the first navy in the world, that is the first and biggest chip in your armour, in your position. The moment you lose that. Now, the problem is, really, is defining what benchmarks you want to set. What benchmarks you really want to set as the first nation in the world. What do you want to be compared on? And that's always a tough debate. That's always a very thorny question. What do you want to be? How do you want to be compared? Right. Now let's sign over to UAD for a bit. So here it is. HMS Agincourt, as I think she would have been. And please note, I am the first one to stick my hands up and say, I could be completely wrong. I have found all sorts of documents around, but I haven't found the smoking gun. I've also found all sorts of details which point to it. There were design studies for 6-inch gun battleships. There were design studies for all sorts of things going on. But I haven't found the actual Agincourt documents. And the ones I have talk about other documents. And I'm still going back to the National Archives. I go to various places. I go hunting for these things. And maybe I'll find them, and maybe I will do a video going, I was wrong. And I look forward to that day if that's the case, because at least then we'll know. But this is what my suspicion a 6, i.e. 3 twin 18-inch gun version of the Queen Elizabeth class fast battleship would have looked like. And yeah. Where's she going off to? She's going off somewhere. Follow her, quickly. I know I could have just clicked down there and followed her, but I for some reason didn't think about her. Now, over her, she is facing a Francisco Caracola. Now, she actually has 15-inch 47s in this design, because that's the closest I can get them to. UAD don't allow me to go down to 15-inch 40s. It's rather like they don't allow me to set an 18-inch battleship earlier than 1930 in the Royal Navy, despite HMS Furious existing. But of course, Furious has 18-inch 40s, and, well, Agincourt here has 18-inch 45s, because that's what I suspect they would have been developing and would have been deploying. Because, again, there were issues with the 15-inch 42. They weren't necessarily the most happy with it. It seems strange to say that when it's become this sort of symbolic gun of Britain as it was, but yeah, there were grumbles that yes, this was a compromise done for speed to get this into service. It would have been better if it would have been a 45. They'd have been far happier, and I think the 18-inch gun which was coming afterwards was definitely going to be a 45. Now, I think we're going to do that. Yeah. I think I'm going to keep you at range. UAD keeps doing this thing where they close down to almost impossible ranges, and they're still doing it, and I thought the latest update might have got that out of it a bit, but it hasn't. And for a 6-gun ship, that's especially bad, in that I did this earlier just to see what would happen, and I ran it 3 times, and 2 times in a row, the first 2 times, when I let UAD control it, they both blew up at the end. I mean, literally, both ships were sunk. And they were trying to say, the Italians won on the one thing and the Brits won on the other one. I went, no, if both ships go kaboom, neither side has won. Okay? You are just going, well, you know, this one went kaboom 2 minutes before the other one did. That doesn't really make for a victory. We won! Boom! We're all gone. Is not really a victory, is it? So, yeah, I would say that was both sides lost. And it has got into 6-inch gun range, which is not something I would like to get into. And the thing is, 15-inch gunships have a rate of fire advantage, even over an 18-inch gunship. They have a rate of fire advantage. This turn was possibly not the most sensible thing I've ever done. But let's make them come to me instead of me going to them, because then that gives my 6 long-range guns more of an advantage. Why are you doing 4 knots? Why did you slow down to 4 knots? I'd really like to know who slowed you. That was probably me, wasn't it? It was me. Okay. So... ooh, sugar. What did the... lucky hit. Straight to the conning tower of an 18-inch shell. That will do it. That will have that effect on you. That will have a significant emotional event for a ship. Let alone for the crew. Now, in terms of Agincourt herself, she's doing okay, but let's be honest, she's keeping out of their 6-inch gun range, which is one, again, reasons I don't like messing around with... I've had to do various things to try and equal what a 15-inch 40 would achieve. And one of the things I don't like is the fact that when you use the explosive and powder for setting for the main guns, it also affects the powder, etc., for the other guns as well, and... there are some 18-inch shells definitely hitting. Ooh. That's looking nasty. But basically, they are now just going in parallel. And, again, this is historically not really accurate in that terms. And of course, remember, in terms of in actual combat operations, there wouldn't have just been HMS Agincourt coming against, say, Francisco Caracola. If they'd been fighting, it would have been a squadron of ships, probably with Agincourt at its head, probably the rest of the Queen Elizabeth class, providing the rest of the battle division. Maybe some R-class in there, but probably the rest of the Queen Elizabeth class. Maybe even some battle cruisers there if they want to keep up speed. But the thing is, her cruising speed is roughly 23 knots, and the others could make roughly 23 knots. So yeah, they probably have standardized on 23 knots for any action. And Agincourt would have been the flagship. And basically, yes, it would be fleet-on-fleet actions. It's amazing. When you handle your fleet like it's supposed to be handled, it happens almost mathematically in terms of, yes, we are not closing to suicidal ranges. So basically what matters is how good our long-range fire is. And which 18-inch shells do tend to be a winning argument. But the point is, even if Britain hadn't built anything after her, if Britain had left it be for a couple of years due to war, etc., they would have laid down the benchmark. And everything built would have been compared to her. You would sit there and go, well, the Colorados, look at how many 16-inch guns they have. They're far more powerful, really. Yes. But she has 18-inch guns and it's faster. But they're more powerful. Yes, they are, but she's the benchmark. And that's the point. When you focus in construction on what were battle cruisers, but called large light cruisers, etc., and battle cruisers, you're trying to shift the benchmark status from the battleship to the battle cruiser. You can argue that's achieved with HMS Hood, to an extent. But let's be honest, it obviously isn't, because when the British Empire is seeking to build itself 2 new capital ships, as I've discussed with Nelson and Rodney, they go for battleships, not battle cruisers. They don't go with the F3 design, despite how good the F3 design would be, how many advantages it would give to the Royal Navy and the wider fleet. They go with the benchmark. And I've been discussing a lot of things around the benchmarking and the necessaries for a first fleet recently, but I wasn't sure if I was making the point clear. So, hope this added to this video. Hope you found that interesting. So, there you go, being a benchmark navy. There are advantages, there are massive advantages, but there are also massive costs, and there are things you end up having to do that probably wouldn't make sense under any other circumstances other than you are maintaining that status of being the benchmark navy and the value of that. And it's not just isolated to navies, there are other areas. The example I tend to bring about is New York and London in terms of financial centres. The amount of effort that goes into sustaining them as being the benchmark financial centres, by them and by their countries that support them. Yes, others will rise and fall, but they maintain their status as benchmark centres, and they do a lot of work to do so. But there are other options, and what I want you to think about, and the question of today is, what other areas do nations strive to maintain a benchmark status? Why do they do so? Think about it. What is important for America to be benchmark in, and the benchmark status of being the benchmark navy, or the benchmark nation in certain things. What other things are important to other areas of national pride that lead to benchmark status? And there are them. Once you start thinking about it, once you start working through it, it suddenly makes a very interesting impact in your thinking in terms of why government priorities might be for X, Y, or Z. because they want to maintain a benchmark status in this scenario. So they're going to do Y, they're going to do Z, they're going to do the things which follow on which necessarily support that. Which might mean they don't always do the thing which is necessarily the best option for them strategically or sensibly in terms of looking at it from a pure logic perspective. Because they've associated and attached the value, and there is a real value, to being a benchmark status in something else. And so they shift priorities. Anyway, thank you for watching. What have we got coming up? Well, we've got an interesting week this week. Tomorrow's video is going to have is Twitch stream, which started off with beavers and ended up with the Ozark Monarchs and various other things being considered. Hope you enjoyed the UAD one of HMS Agincourt. It's a pretty good little video. It's a pretty good little ship. It's having the benchmark navy is not just about being that navy. It's not just about being the largest navy or the biggest navy in the world. You have to do more than just that. And it's important because you can be the largest navy in the world and still not be the benchmark. Because of what you have and what you are seen to have versus what the benchmark navy has. This is why I said at times in history that the Dutch and the Spanish have been there, because they have been the benchmarks that global navies were comparing themselves to. Being first navy means, to be the first navy you have to be also the benchmark navy. But you can be benchmark navy without being the first navy. And if the first navy is not the benchmark navy, they are undermined. Because it's a case of, yeah, you're big, but you're not that smart. You're not that capable. You're always following on with your ships. Warrior is a good example, again, to get into and remind ourselves on this point. Gloire is made first, but Warrior is the benchmark. Why? Because being first only counts when you're producing equivalent ships. That's how you achieve the benchmark. When people are actually within a similar technological realm as you, that's when being first is what allows you to create the benchmark. If you consider HMS Warrior, the Royal Navy is able to knock the Gloire off the front page onto the, not even the chip paper of yesterday, by producing the Warrior versus the Gloire and coming in. Dreadnought's good, but she's not so much better than the other ships being built at a similar time, that if she had come out after them, she would have had the same status. She wouldn't have been the benchmark ship. She's not a Warrior to Gloire. She needed to be first, because the others are building good quality ships. And it's the same when we're talking later in 1913, 1914. The next generation of ships are coming. The Americans are working on the 16-inch ships. The Italians are working on the fast battleships. And the British notice. The British need to jump. Today, we can see what's going on with some of the projects. We can tell where the motion going in. Why does there keep being a subtle emphasis going on nuclear submarines, on attack submarines, on SSNs? Because they're benchmarks, and because their capabilities are incredibly important at the moment. And we can say, well, with the coming drones, etc., things could be on the cusp of changing dramatically. Well, guess what? Battleships achieved their greatest status of benchmark nature before the rise of the aircraft carrier and the rise of aircraft. Battle cruisers, you can argue modern ships are built around speed and firepower, where armour is more about subdivision. You can argue that very cogently. So you could argue Jackie Fisher was right with Courageous, Glorious and Furious and those things, the renowns over Agincourt. You can argue that. But he was ahead of his time, you can also argue that point, because what you can't achieve that with guns what you can achieve with missiles in terms of range and speed of engagement. The thing is, he was on the right track, but about 40 years, 50 years too early. Which is bad judgment on his part. Anyway, I have a fluffy research assistant. Just come in. It's been raining. I thought you were staying inside in the warm. No, you've come in. And I'm going to get on with the rest of the key ships. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you are having a nice time. And thank you very much for watching. Take care.